Hey everyone, I'm Mark, and with the release of Flight Sim 2024, you might be buying your first peripherals if you're just getting into this hobby, or maybe you're thinking of upgrading some of your existing devices that you already have. So today we're going to have a look at where to get started, what to consider when making a purchase, and have a quick look at the different quality levels that are available. Although some of the components we're going to look at are available on Xbox, the reality is that being PC based is going to give you access to way more options and quality levels. However, that has changed a little bit in the past few years thanks to the massive influx of Xbox pilots, but it's still nowhere near what you can get on PC. There are also a lot of different ways that you can go with your setup, from giving it more of a general aviation feel to full airliner setups if that's all that you're interested in. And on top of all of that, there are some basic things that you can upgrade that'll benefit you regardless of which way you want to go. Let's start from the beginning though, and in most planes like the C-152 that we're in right now, the number one thing that you're going to interact with is the control column. A common place to start is often going to be with a plain old controller like you'd have on Xbox, and while that does get the job done, the experience will feel a lot more generic and arcade-like since it's really meant as a do-everything device. The two main options then are flight sticks and yokes, which both serve the same function but in very different ways. And while there are different quality and budget levels for both, a side stick is where a lot of us start off since they're usually a much more affordable option. Probably the most common beginner stick out there is the Logitech Extreme Pro 3D. I'd be willing to bet that most longtime flight simmers have one lying around somewhere, and even something as basic as this though will go a long way to making you feel more connected to the plane that you're flying. These entry-level devices are kind of an all-in-one solution. They give you control over the pitch and roll axis, along with the twist action of the stick that can act as a very crude substitute for rudder pedals, on top of having a very basic throttle as well. The main problem with these cheaper devices though are the low quality potentiometers inside them that are used to measure how you've moved the stick, and before you know it you'll end up with noise on your axes, causing the plane to just randomly start to jerk around. Middle tier sticks like the Winwing Ursa Minor, the Turtle Beach Velocity 1, and the Thrustmaster TCA that I have here are often advertised as having Hall effect sensors that are less prone to that noise. However, you have to do your research on any device that you buy because it's not always the whole story. For example, the TCA stick has Hall effect sensors for the pitch and roll axis, which is great, but what it doesn't say is that the rudder axis is still a potentiometer, and if you look online, you'll actually find a ton of people having issues with it. So with all of that in mind, the way I see it is that there are two main ways to look at your first hardware purchase. The first of those is to go straight to a middle tier stick since they don't break the bank, they have a better experience than an entry level controller, and they should be more reliable overall for a longer period of time. The other option is to go with a cheaper device first, like the Logitech, with the idea that if you end up really enjoying flight simming, when it comes time to upgrade, you can look at some much more serious gear without feeling like you sunk too much into it from the start. So it's all about balance and what you want to do. In terms of those higher quality options, the two that come up often are VKB and Virpol, and what sets them apart is mostly the construction material that they use for the grips and the base, including the gimbals, which give their controllers a completely different feel from anything else that you can get. The other advantage with the higher end devices is that you can buy a base from a grip separately, so it gives you more flexibility. Even though a lot of the grips have more of a military or helicopter feel, there are starting to be some civilian grips as well, and there are also third parties that make some compatible options too. Another upgrade path from an entry-level stick is to go for a yoke instead, and if you mostly fly general aviation, Boeings, or older airliners, a yoke is going to feel much more authentic, and ultimately you'll feel more connected to what you're flying since the controls definitely feel heavier to manipulate. They do take up a lot of space though, and if you share your flight sim space with where you do your real job like me, you'll definitely want a big enough desk that you can just leave it mounted at all times and slide it over to the side when it's not in use. Otherwise, if you have to mount and unmount it every time, before you know it, it's just going to be sitting in the closet unused. A quality yoke usually comes with a high price tag though, and for that reason I see them more as something that you get as an upgrade once you have a complete setup in place with the controls, the throttle quadrant, and the rudder pedals, especially since you need those rudder pedals to manipulate the yaw axis at that point. Ultimately, it comes down to budget and how realistic you want to make your setup. And for me, I found that having a middle tier flight stick with a higher end yoke made more sense because I spend a lot more time in planes that are yoke based, but you can absolutely fly any type of plane with either type of control. The last thing that I want to mention before moving on is the force feedback movement, which is picking up a lot of steam in the last few months, both on the yoke side with projects like the FlightSim CLS60 and on the flight stick side with the Moza base. And I think this will change the high-end landscape for controllers in the coming years, but I wouldn't hold back on purchasing a non-force feedback controller quite yet. Alright, so the next thing that you'll likely want to get for your setup is a throttle quadrant, since it's going to give you a lot more precise and realistic engine management, and sometimes it can even be used to manipulate other systems like the flaps, the landing gear, or even the autopilot. General aviation style quadrants will be more focused on having a throttle, prop, and mixture control, and there are options at all budget and quality levels again, so I'll leave some links in the description for you to have a look at them on your own time. Airliner style quadrants, on the other hand, are often designed to replicate the throttle systems that you'd find in commercial jets instead, like the Airbus throttle that I have here, which has physical detents where you would set the throttle during the flight, and it makes it a lot easier to fly that type of plane properly. At the end of the day though, all of these controls have axes that you can bind to anything you want in flight sim, so you could reprogram this throttle to work for a GA plane and vice versa. However, at times you'll have to do some workarounds to get things to work correctly, so it's not always going to be perfect. One example out of many that I have is that if you were to try to use this throttle for GA flying by programming one axis to be the throttle and the other to be the mixture, the detents that we were just talking about are going to make it hard to adjust the power properly for a GA plane. And while you can disable those detents by changing the configuration of the controller, it takes time to go back and forth, so it's difficult to find a middle ground, and you end up compromising on both experiences. One way to approach this then is to buy the throttle quadrant for what you're going to be flying the most and then make everything else work around it. And eventually, if you see that you fly enough of another type of plane, you can get a separate throttle for that if you feel the need. That being said though, if you already know that you like to fly a little bit of everything and you're looking for an upgrade, the best option hands down is still the Honeycomb Bravo, even with all the difficulty that the company has been going through over the last year. With its 6 axes and swappable levers, you can set it up for anything from a single engine prop to a 4-engine airliner, on top of getting the gear control, autopilot, and a bunch of switches as well that you can program to whatever you want. And there's also a huge aftermarket for levers that you can buy for it as well that'll make your experience feel even more genuine. It's at this point though that it starts to become a little bit tricky to keep open space on your desk, and the approach that I ended up going with was I mounted the Honeycomb to a small coffee table that I found that fit perfectly under it, and like that I can slide it over when I'm not using it, or even just move it out entirely by unplugging it. What I ended up doing for the Airbus throttle, because I do still use it for flying any Airbuses, is I actually ran a few USB extension cables around my desk so that when I need it, I can just quickly pull it out of the closet, plug it in, and I'm ready to go. The main takeaway from all of this is that it's important to think about what you want to do with your setup today, but also try and predict where you're going to be a year from now, because that way you can save a little bit of money down the line. The last of the big 3 items that I think you need to have for a proper flight sim setup are the rudder pedals, which often get left till later. Even I remember thinking for the longest time that I could just use the twist action on my flight stick and it'd be the same thing. But once you actually get your first set, you quickly realize how much you've been missing out on. They give you much more precise control over your aircraft's yaw axis, which is important anytime the wind is blowing across the plane, either on takeoff or landing, but also while taxiing around, they're going to help you to make those corners a little bit easier. Another big plus is the ability to brake linearly instead of just the on-off braking that you get with a button assignment. So if you're coming in a little bit too fast, you can apply just a little bit of pressure to start once you touch down, rather than having it just slam on the brakes when you hold the button down, so it'll be a whole lot more controllable. I still have the entry-level Thrustmaster pedals here, which are functional and they have a small footprint, which is a big plus for me. But once I eventually replace them, I'll be looking into a higher-end option like the MFG Crosswinds, the Virpil VPC Aces, or the Thrustmaster TPRs, which all seem really good. So for me, those three, the control column, the throttle quadrant, and the pedals are the core items that anyone who wants to truly enjoy their flight simming should have, but it's nowhere near the end of what you can do. So what we'll do now is just quickly go over a few additional things that can make things easier or more fun. First off, if you're tired of endlessly spinning knobs on the nav radios, you could get a dedicated radio panel like the Logitech, which makes managing your comms much more intuitive and a lot easier too, since you have a physical device with which to set it. There's also been a large number of airliner panels that have become available in the last year or so from companies like WinWing and Mini Cockpit. So again, if you want a more hands-on experience with those, that could be an interesting option to look at. Although for a lot of these things, you have to start to think about your setup and how you'll mount everything, because without a dedicated space, it can start to get very cramped very quickly. In terms of immersion, VR is the biggest game changer for flight sim because it brings you into the world more than anything else can, but it's important to keep in mind that it is pretty demanding on your system, and each headset has its strengths and weaknesses with things like clarity and field of view, so again, you'll definitely want to do your research before committing to an option. I have an average spec PC, so I end up using my Meta Quest 3 for takeoff and landing only, and then I'll switch back into normal mode once I'm settled into the climb to get those better looking graphics. But I would say it's worth it even just for that, because it's the closest you can get to feeling like you're in an actual plane from the comfort of your own home. Another option, if you don't want to go VR, is to look at a head and eye tracker instead. It can be pretty useful, especially for takeoff and landing, again, to be able to look around and keep the runway in sight at the same time. And I've got a full review of the Tobii eye tracker on the channel already if you want to have a look at that. Also, don't overlook the importance of good audio in your flight sim setup. A quality headset or a speaker system can really bring flight sim to life, from the rumble of the engines to the rest of the environment around you. And in planes with high quality sound sets, it can even alert you to certain problems ahead of time. On the visual side of things, you can get by with a 1080p resolution if that's all that you've got. However, a 2K screen can really make a world of difference in terms of the rendering quality, and I didn't actually find it had much of an impact, if at all, on performance when I upgraded my screens, and I have average specs at best. On top of that, a multi-monitor setup gives you the ability to have Flight Sim open on one screen while keeping flight plans, charts, ATC windows, or even virtual airline software open on the other. And like that, you don't have to context switch out of Flight Sim, which makes a really big difference in terms of immersion. I hope this video gave you a good idea of where to start and of the endless possibilities that there are when it comes to flight sim hardware. And if you enjoyed it, please make sure to like the video and subscribe as well so you don't miss out on the next one.